Kicking off our month centered around democracy, we have Ben Jealous with us here today. Ben is a former Democratic nominee for Governor of Maryland, former national president of the NAACP, current national president for People for the American Way, and for more than half a decade has been investing in social impact startups. Ben is also the author of Reach, 40 Black Men Speak on Living, Leading, and Succeeding. We are so happy to have you with us today. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here with you.
So we would just love to start off by asking you kind of what a healthy democracy looks like in your eyes.
Our country should be a place where no child is limited by anything but their own drive and what's inside of them. And instead, our country is a place where gender discrimination, racial discrimination, class-based discrimination are like ropes holding children back. The work that we do in the civil rights movement, the work I led at the NAACP and I lead now at People for the American Way, is designed to just continue the process of removing roadblocks to full participation. If you look at our democracy right now, I'd say one of the things that's kind of hardest to explain to young people is that the national popular vote does not determine who becomes president. The popular vote determines who becomes mayor, who becomes governor, and then all of a sudden when it gets to president, it becomes very complex. That's one of the things that we're focused on fixing right now.
And you talked a little bit about this, but more specifically, we'd love to hear about your personal work with the NAACP when you were with them. And for those who don't know yet, what does that organization aim to achieve?
Sure. I was born into the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. My son was born during the 2012 National Convention. Our family has belonged, my children are the sixth generation. The first was my grandmother's grandfather. He'd been born a slave. He died having served as a state legislator in Virginia. And joining the NAACP for him was a way of bringing our family into it, of continuing the work of the movement against slavery. At the time, slavery continued in form, if you will, if not in fact. There was peonage, there were sharecropping, there were all these ways of tying Black folks basically to a plantation and exploiting them. And they were very much this old convict lease system. The NAACP was founded to stop that. It was founded to stop lynchings, very similar to the police killing of unarmed civilians that we see today, typically Black men, but not exclusively. Mm-hmm. And we were founded to open up our democracy so that everybody could vote. Mm-hmm. And that name, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, it confuses folks. They don't quite understand what it means. Explain it to them like this. The NAACP was actually first founded as the National Negro Association. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of our founders, one of the more famous founders, very famous Black sociologist, came into a meeting in the first year and says, we've got to change the name. They're like, we're a year old. It's like your podcast, right? Like you wouldn't change the name of your podcast now, right? But it's, it's like, we got to change the name. And they're like, why? It's like, because it sounds like this is just about Black people or maybe putting Black people on top. No, this organization is part of a global movement to end colonialism and to end the apartheid and segregation that the traditions of colonialism have wrought from South Africa to the United States. In other words, all we want to do is lift people of color up to the same level that whites through colonialism have placed themselves on. Mm-hmm. And in other words, we don't want to push anybody down. We just want to lift 3/4 of humanity up. The phrase colored people in America is synonymous with Blacks, but in the global context, and even in our country, which has always been more diverse than just Blacks and whites, referred to anybody who was not white. In fact, at the time, for many, it even included Irish Catholics who were not seen as white by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in the context of the UK, and of course, who had been colonized for centuries. And so that's the idea of the name. You know, that's really the tradition of the work. We at People For were started 40 years ago by Congresswoman Barbara Jordan, a Black Congresswoman from Texas, very much the AOC of her day, and Norman Lear, who was the creator of Facts of Life and Good Times and All in the Family, and a number of Maude, a number of the Jeffersons of path-breaking TV shows, because they were afraid that the far right wing was building a movement that was getting increasing power in our country, and we had to create an interracial, a multiracial group to oppose them. And I'd say the events of the last week, everything from really breaking the color barrier, but also the common sense barrier, and who Georgia sends to the U.S. So there was a lot going on there. You know, we didn't just send a pastor from Martin Luther King's pulpit, but we sent a young white investigative reporter to the Senate, tremendous, from Georgia, you know, followed by events at the Capitol, where the only debate is, you know, do we refer to it as a riot? Do you refer to it as a lynch mob? Do you refer to it as a coup? You know, or do you just say that it was an act of sedition? Like, whatever it was, what was happening at the Capitol was a reminder that the far right wing is a real threat in our country.
Mm-hmm. And you touched on it a little bit about how the NAACP worked on democracy, like founded on democracy, and, you know, helping Black people get the right to vote. And so just kind of generally, how does the NAACP work on a democracy level? And is there a lot of correspondence between everyday people and policymakers in the government?
So the answer to the last question is yes. There's not just correspondence, there's emails, there's texts, there's letters. There's also just organizing people to really show up at their state capitals, or these days, you know, have a series of Zoom meetings and talk directly with the politicians who represent them about why laws need to change in order for people to be able to get ahead more fluidly, be able to be treated justly and fairly. Mm-hmm. On democracy, the NAACP is really focused on its legacy of ending voter suppression. And one of the things that's most alarming about these times is the rise of voter suppression. Voter suppression is anything that makes it harder to vote unnecessarily. Mm-hmm. Now, in this country, you know, imagine we had like a room full of people, right? Say any high school, no matter how Black or how white in our country. The schools now are sadly more segregated than they were 50 years ago in most places. And you said, raise your hands. Raise your hands if you descend from former slaves. Raise your hands if you descend from any group of color. Raise your hand if you descend from poor white men who did not own any land. Raise your hand if you descend from a woman. Well, the entire room, no matter how white, is raising their hands, right? Because of course we all descend from mom, if nothing else. But what surprises people in there, you remember that we kept all women from voting until literally a few months over 100 years ago. They remember that we kept most Black folks from voting throughout our history, and not surprising people of color. What they forget is that the privates in the Revolutionary Army, the bulk of the Revolutionary Army, were themselves denied the right to vote, because we said that we said that men who did not own land could steal elections. That if you were not tied to one place, you and your friends could hop on horses and ride to the next town and steal the election. Of course, that never happened, but it shows you what we're up against now. Because the people who are pushing through voter suppression measures, they always frame it as voter security. You know, you heard how they excused suppressing the vote of poor white men. For women, they said any man with a wife would have 2 votes, so it wasn't fair. Imagine your father trying to tell your mother how to vote. It's not going to go well. if your mother tells your father how to go, you might shrug and just go do it. But your father actually tries to tell your mother how to vote. Good luck. But that was the rationale. And of course, with Black folks, they basically said that we lack the mental capacity to vote. That was essentially their argument, which was phenomenally offensive and also just untrue. And so today, what do you see? You see people saying, oh, well, we don't know if these people are voters. We need to have identification. Again, vote security. It's what they're doing is they're trying to make it harder. In order to get that ID, you're going to have to spend money. In order to get that, to have the ID, you're going to have to remember to bring your wallet. Sometimes in order to get the ID, you're going to have to spend money on getting a birth certificate. And if you're a Black person who's old enough, there may be none that exists. My grandmother's birth certificate is written in her mother's hand, because in the county my grandmother was born in, they didn't give birth certificates to pigs or chickens or Negroes. But my grandmother's mother was so fair-skinned that she got the white clerk to agree to let her create birth certificates for Black children for free, on the theory that she was willing to work in his office for free. I mean, feels a little bit like slavery, but it was very much part of the freedom struggle, because she knew that those Black children were going to need to have birth certificates if they were ever going to go anywhere. And she was so light that people didn't realize she was Black, and she just sat in the back corner and wrote those birth certificates. But now, if one of my grandmother's younger siblings say my grandmother's 104, still alive, if like one of their friends wants to go get a birth certificate, well, if my great grandma didn't write their birth certificate, it doesn't exist. So that's what we're dealing with. And their fundamental thing is that they're simply trying to make voting harder. You're seeing in Georgia, they're saying, we need to have fewer polling places. They're just trying to make it harder. And it's a way for a minority to try and stay in power, an empowered, wealthy minority to try to stay in power by making it harder for populations that are increasing in size to vote.
And we wanted to talk to you about your novel, Reach, 40 Black Men Speak on Living, Leading, and Succeeding, what inspired you to take part in this project and what it is.
It was, when I was young, there was a book called Face Forward that was a very expensive kind of coffee table book of images of young Black men who were helping to build stronger communities, build a stronger country. And I was profiled in that book. And the target audience for that book was ultimately, young Black men who needed some inspiration, see people like themselves doing interesting things. The book was so expensive, and Black people in America, we have about 40% of the wealth of the white community overall. We kind of cluster to the lower half of the white economic strata. That book became the most stolen book in America from bookstores. It got put behind the counter at Barnes and Nobles and stuff, because you had people who were trying, who didn't have any money, trying to explain to inspire children who didn't have any money, and the book cost like $45, and that for them literally could be groceries for the week. And so Reach is like a pulp paperback. We made it to be the least expensive type of book. To continue the mission that book Face Forward had started, trying to get stories into the hands of young Black folks that would inspire them about all they could achieve. In this case, though, we decided to focus on people of every generation. And what Reach does is to really focus on the decision points in their lives. When they decided to, when they had a choice, it came to a fork in the road, they could go this way or that way. And they chose the path least traveled, and as the poet Robert Bly says, it made all the difference. And so that's it. It's like little short stories about choice points in men's lives. One of the ones that really sticks with me is a man named Lou Gossett Jr. He's a very famous Black actor. He was, I think, the second Black man to ever win an Oscar. And he was third. The first was Sidney Poitier, then Harry Belafonte, and then Louis Gossett Jr. as far as the third Black leading man in the history of Hollywood. And Lou told a story in that book about playing superhero with his white best friend when he was like 6 years old. And he's in his 80s now. This is like 75 years ago. Very different America. Mm-hmm. and he wanted to be Superman. But he felt like he could only play like Batman because Batman wears a mask and nobody really knows what Batman's race is. He wears a mask, he wears gloves. He didn't feel like he could play Superman because everybody knew that Superman was white. And his friend looked at him and he said, you know, Lou, you want to be Superman? Well, you're Superman today because you're Superman to me. And that became, I mean, this is literally the shift in a little black boy's brain when he's 6 years old that empowers him to be a leading man in Hollywood 20 years later. The idea is his little white friend telling him that you can be Superman. So that's ultimately, those are the shifts we're trying to make in children's brains with the books. So let's get them to understand that they can be Superman too.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, this is what you've said, but kind of just what are the takeaways that you hope people take from reading that book? And yeah, I guess that's kind of, you know, it's meant to inspire, but generally, like, what are the takeaways that you want people to have?
You know, it depends, right? If you're a black child writing the book, reading the book, we want you to really take away that you can be anything. If you're a child of any color reading the book, we want you to take away that you can be anything. If you're an adult reading the book, we want you to understand that Tamir Rice, who was 12 years old and playing with a toy gun, a BB gun in a park, and was shot through in about 3 seconds by a white officer who didn't even stop to ask him his name, just shot and killed him, was just as much of a child as any white kid that you've ever seen. You know, I mean, that's the way in which we demonize black children as something other than children. Really has given license for this type of terror that black parents like myself have to raise our kids in. You know, I went through a situation with my son where he was having separation anxiety because he had been overseas with his mom for a year traveling, and great privilege, but at age 6 maybe it was hard for him to be away from dad. So he comes back and he goes to his public elementary school, predominantly white elementary school in a privileged community. The first time he tries to run out the front door to get back in my car, you know, we have a couple of conversation with him. The second time he acts up a little bit, like tapping his foot in the classroom. You know, we have a conversation, and then eventually he's run out the front door 2 or 3 times, and they say, we're going to have to call the police if your son runs out the front door again. And you're like, I'm pretty sure every child here who has separation anxiety, you don't call the police on. He was in the 2nd grade, mind you, when they run out the front door trying to get into their parents' car. And yet, with black boys, it just feels normal. So now my son's at a private school, you know, but it's that thing. We hope that it humanizes the, you know, black people.
Mm-hmm. And we wanted to jump back to talking about democracy again, because you mentioned what happened at the Capitol, and wanted to really ask you about how people can help preserve our democracy and preserve the right to elect our leaders.
Well, first of all, I want to commend you all for just taking an interest in this. You know, our democracy is re-strengthened by every generation. And as the father of a brilliant 15-year-old high school student, my daughter Morgan, it is really nice to see 2 young ladies in high school curating a conversation like this. What I would say is, what happened last week at the Capitol is the extension of a tradition of politically motivated, racially motivated violence in our country. The NAACP was founded by a similar event, a race riot in the state capital of, I'm stuttering, but in Springfield, which is the state capital of Illinois, a century ago. And what we saw there wasn't very, you know, was of the same spirit. What was enraging them was that people of color had been able to vote like any other person in this country, and the outcome wasn't what these folks had hoped for. Their targets here are the first 3 folks that I saw were taking refuge were a Catholic, a Jew, and a Black, all Congress people. Nancy Pelosi, Ben Cardin, Kwesi, and Fume. Well, those 3 groups were the three main targets of lynching in the history of our country. These folks violently attacked our Capitol as part of a secession movement and killed a police officer. The last time that a secession movement violently attacked the US Capitol that I know of was the Puerto Rican independence movement, I believe in the 1950s, who didn't kill anybody, and they were charged with conspiracy to commit sedition. And yet the only charges that we've seen so far have been for assault-related crimes and theft-related crimes. And an inability so far, hopefully will change when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris take over, of the DOJ to actually wrap their mouth around the word sedition and deal with the underlying political crimes here. And what I know is that if you don't prosecute people for crimes like this, they get worse. One of the reasons why you never saw the Puerto Rican independence movement attack the US Capitol again is the folks went to federal prison for a very long time. And that's what's going to need to happen here. Now, we as individuals, to protect our democracy, really have to stay engaged in fighting voter suppression. Right now, that means calling our congresspeople and our senators, telling them to pass H.R. 1, which is a whole set of, it's a big omnibus voting rights bill, H.R. 4, which is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and H.R. 51, which would allow the people of Washington, D.C., it's not lost on the rest of the world that the citizens of the United States Capitol do not have Democratic representation in their legislature. And so this would finally fix that by making D.C. a state whose population, by the way, is bigger than several other states, little states like Wyoming, for example. And so that's what we need to be doing right now. The next thing is to keep doing what so many folks did this year, which is taking their time to call and text and push other people out to vote. John Lewis, my dear friend, understood in his bones that the antidote to voter suppression, like in the context of an election, is massive voter turnout. And I'm very, very proud of the young people of this country of all colors in the way that they stood up to the vote suppressors this fall and this month. And we just got to keep on doing it.
Yeah, and thank you so much for meeting with us today. We're so grateful to have gotten to speak with you, and we've learned, I know I can speak on behalf of Layla, and we've learned so much by this conversation, and we know that everyone watching has too. And like we always say, now that we have learned so much, it is time to take action. Go to the NAACP or pfaw.org. And also go to defendtheblackvote.org. And if you want to go learn a little bit more about what we spoke about, his book Reach, go to, where can they buy?
You just Google Reach Ben Jealous, it'll pop right up. You can buy it on Amazon.
Yeah, so do that, because I know I'm gonna go read it. I'm very fascinated by what you spoke about. So thank you so much, Ben. It was so great meeting you and speaking with you.
Thank you. Appreciate you both.